Welcome to the new world. We have our in-depth conversations in times of change. And today we have a special guest from the UK and currently living in Switzerland. Carmody Grey. She has recently been appointed as a special professor in Integral Ecology at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. She's an ethicist, has a philosophical and theological background, teaching at the University of Bern. As well, earlier she was teaching at the University of Durham and still is there, an honorary fellow. Regular broadcasting in the UK about ecological issues, an advisor of civil society organizations on ecological issues. So we are very honored to have you here. And great that you, congratulations with your new appointment.
Thank you very much.
Which was just October, I think, was the official.
Yeah, 1st of October.
The first was the starting date. Great. And
Thank
a very interesting initiative, I think, that has been taken by Socires, the think tank, together with the University of the Radboud University in Nijmegen.
Yeah.
To have this special chair and an institute even attached to it, an Integral Ecological Institute.
Yeah.
And it was inspired by an encyclical of Pope Francis, the encyclical Laudato Si. Now, it may be just good for just to explain what is an encyclical actually. Can you just, what is that? What kind of things are this? I have a kind of thing for the view. You can see it here, Laudato Si, in print of the Holy Father Francis. And it is with the subtitle "On Care of our for Our Common Home." So, but an encyclical, what is it? Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. That's a great question, and not an often asked question. Actually, people tend to know Laudato Si, the title, but they don't really understand what kind of document it is or what its genre is. And this is actually important for understanding both its strengths and its weaknesses, the things that it tries to do and the things that it doesn't try to do. So the word in English, the word encyclical, means something like regular. An encyclical letter is the routine expression of the papal teaching office. It is not routine in the sense that there's a kind of schedule to it, but it's routine in the sense that this is the normal way in which the Pope exercises his teaching authority at the highest level. Many people know that the popes, that Catholics believe that the Pope is infallible. That's a complicated thing. The Pope has the charism of infallibility, the capability of speaking infallibly, but that doesn't mean that everything that the Pope says or writes has the charism of infallibility. Right? Charism in English just means like the gift or the power, if you like. Encyclical letters are not infallible documents.
Okay, that's good to know.
That's important.
Are not dogmas.
They are not dogmas.
No, okay, yeah.
Precisely. They are not dogmas. Dogmas may be declared or pronounced by a pope, and that has happened twice in history since the definition of infallibility was agreed in the 19th century. So that charism of infallibility has properly been exercised only twice, but that is not the function of an encyclical letter. An encyclical letter is the Pope teaching the faithful and sometimes speaking to the world beyond the faithful on a whole changing range of topics, some of which may be dogmatic in the strict theological sense, to do with dogma, and some of which may be pastoral. Within that genre of encyclicals, one strand of that genre is what's called Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is the Church's teaching, the whole body of the Church's teaching on, in very, very broad terms, how human beings should live in this world. The assumption behind Catholic social teaching is simply...
I think as well, about the tradition of social teaching, in a way, has been very old, I think, but started as well in a specific sense in the 19th century. So live in the modern world. I think,
Yes. Absolutely, live in the modern world. The modern tradition of Catholic social teaching started in 1891 with an important document called Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII. What's important to say, though, and I'll bring this back to Laudato Si in a second, Catholic social teaching is a new tradition, but it's not absolutely new. The thinking is something like this. What the Christian faith is a vision for human life. That always has implications for how we live together and how we live in the material world. It's never implication-free. It's concrete, it's practical, it's not just in a spiritual space somewhere else. The church doesn't only have views, as it were, or teachings about doctrine, in the abstract sense. Doctrine, by the way, is not abstract, but lots of people think that it is. It has the obligation, if you like, or the calling, as all Christians do, to think through what this means for how we should live. That's been happening since the very beginning, right? We find that in the thought of the Church Fathers, right, in the 3rd and 4th century.
Yeah, so that way before the 19th century.
Way before the 19th century.
So we in the early church, basically.
Yeah, so it bothers me sometimes when people say, oh, this is a new tradition. Not really. It attained a new structure, if you like, a new formalised structure and a new sense of focus because of the changed conditions of modernity, but it's not new in an absolute sense. But so coming back to the question of the encyclicals, within the world of papal encyclicals, or the kind of library, if you like, the growing library of encyclical letters, by the way, popes have been writing encyclicals since long before the 19th century, there is a sort of subset that we might characterise as the social teaching encyclicals. And that's a very clear lineage and constitutes a very clear body of teaching, which is often referred to as the Church's best kept secret. Sometimes also referred to as the jewel in the crown of the Church. It's really an astonishingly rich, sophisticated, compelling, coherent set of reflections. I think it's not a set of prescriptions, it's a set of reflections. Yeah. And I would say that even if I wasn't Catholic, by the way, I would say, I happen to be Catholic, but even if I wasn't, I would say that the quality of sanity and wholeness in this vision is exceptional.
Yeah, I started to with my students as well that they have to always to read some pages of some encyclicals, and I started way back when, especially I think when Caritas in Veritate, with Pope Benedict.
Yeah.
And then my students who come from all different backgrounds and usually totally secular. And they say, well, is this the same old man that we see on television and just against, abortion and against everything and contraceptives, etc. And writing these kind of texts. So how can we make sense of this? Because they were very impressed by actually the content of it and by the actual, you can say the topicality. So you can say they're really going into the issues that was as a response to the credit crisis. And I said, wow. So that's kind of talking about the best kept secret that I experienced that in my classes.
It's so frustrating that Catholic social teaching is not better known because people only know the kind of headline controversies and they associate the Church's teaching office with those. And they don't realise that the Church's teaching office is so much richer and more humane than that. And when you get into the social encyclicals, that's so apparent. And it's a dare I say, it's a fault of the way that, I don't know, the way that that Catholicism has been kind of presented in the public space. That's not front and centre.
No. And can you tell a little bit, because I think that is as well kind of unique there, that the way how these encyclicals are produced, how they come together, because it is not the Pope sitting there somewhere in the Vatican in an office and with his study, with his books, and he writes something like this. I think they have a very different way of emerging, so to say, of being produced. Yeah. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Laudato Si is a social teaching encyclical. It's in this tradition of social encyclicals. When the Pope decides to write an encyclical, he gathers around him all the people best in the world to help him reflect on this question or this topic. In the case of a dogmatic encyclical, that might be theologians and philosophers. In the case of a social encyclical, that includes people from multiple disciplines. So it will include social scientists, in the case of Laudato Si, ecologists, natural scientists, climate scientists, people who work in development, as well as theologians, ethicists and the like. And people get together and share from across this very, very intramural transdisciplinary space. And often they actually write it. So to say that it's a document by committee gives slightly the wrong flavour, because ultimately the Pope is the author. right? When it's presented in the public space, as you can see from the title, it is a letter from the Pope to everyone. It's deeply personal in that sense. It's not a teaching document. I call it a teaching document. That's not so helpful, right? It is an actual letter. Dear everybody, love the Pope, right? So that is the Pope's stamp upon it, and he makes it his own, but he will invite many, many different people to draft different sections, and then they'll submit it. There'll be conversations. There'll be an editing process, a very complex and repeated editing process going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So you get the richest and most, how can I put it? You get the widest range of inputs consistent with having a single overall vision.
Yeah.
It's this fascinating combination of multi-authorship and single authorship. The multi-authorship, of course, is not so visible, but when you know a little bit about the way the encyclical is written, the multi-authorship is very visible. But in this way that the Pope also gets to make it his own. So that's why Laudato Si, I mean, the Pope didn't just wake up in the morning and think, I think today I'll write about the environment. That's not how it works. It's a long process of consultation, a long process of
and especially as well with both, you can say, very different backgrounds, and you mentioned that already. They're not just theologians, but indeed the climate scientists, etc.
Yeah.
So there is no, in that sense, it really tries to be, as far as I can see as well from the text, to be you can say at the level, at the current stage of say climate science, etc.
Exactly.
And then give a perspective on
this.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes I think there's this idea that the Pope has kind of impressionistic, but ultimately distanced sort of moral views about things that he then just trots out whenever the moment comes. It's not like that at all. The Pope takes, and indeed the magisterium more generally, right? The magisterium in this context simply means the teaching office, so that includes also bishops and archbishops and other people, takes extreme pains to produce the most informed overall take on a situation. And again, it's important to say the goal of the social teaching tradition is not to tell people what to do. It's not a series of prescriptions. It's not a 10 commandments. It's a gathered assembly of practical reflections on a specific issue or family of issues that is then offered in a spirit of dialogue. And that's particularly true with Laudato Si, right? Yeah. It's not plonked down on the table in a kind of, and this is the Bible and you jolly well believe it kind of way. It's not like that at all. It's an actual invitation for the conversation out of which that encyclical was written to be taken up and to go on by as many people as possible. And I'll just say one more thing about that. Encyclical letters have an object of address, like all letters. All letters are to someone. Some letters, and certainly the original encyclical, not the original, earlier, previous encyclical letters were often written only to the bishops, right, to the other teachers of the people of God. And the Pope was saying, you are the teachers, I would like you to teach this as your leader. That encyclical letter is addressed to every single person living on this planet. It's not supposed to be a kind of in-house, sectarian. What Catholics believe is this. It's supposed to be totally invitational. The basis of that is the following. Every single person on this planet has no other home. We all live here. We never will, never have and never will live anywhere else. The thing that we all have in common is that. So the proper object of invitation, the proper object of address in this letter is all humanity. And in that sense, it is the Pope speaking as the Pope, but it's also the Pope speaking as just a moral leader of humanity, trying to get everybody around the table. And it starts around this table, if you like, in the Vatican with all these experts. But the object is to get the humanity around the table, because humanity needs to get around the table.
Yeah, and of course it is very, very interesting, and people, especially in the Netherlands, are we have kind of very weak church in general, the Catholic Church in the Netherlands, and we have secularization, etc. But they don't realize, I think, often that we are talking about 1.3 billion people worldwide who take this as authoritative, and in that sense, it is highly influential and much more important than what all kind of philosophers are doing, as far as I can see. Although I am a philosopher, people say even that, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement, perhaps would not have been there, would not be in there 6-7 months earlier, this Laudato Si Encyclical.
Absolutely,
but in a way, I think people were surprised to have, and that is my students now when they read nowadays they have to read Laudato Si or the later letter Laudatum Deum, the smaller kind of summary of this.
Yeah.
And they are surprised and say, is this the church? But I think a lot of people were surprised. How much of a turnaround was this sudden, you can say, attention for ecological questions in the church? Because usually this was not there for a long time, I guess. But you can fill me in on this.
Well, I said earlier that I find it annoying when Catholic social teaching is regarded as is described as a new tradition. And it also bothers me a little bit when the environmental sensibility is regarded as something new or something that started with Laudato Si. Pope Francis takes a lot of trouble in this letter to demonstrate this concern is native to Christian tradition and was anticipated, more than anticipated, was called for by a whole series of recent popes going back arguably to Paul VI, right? So that's the 60s and 70s, certainly. So as long as there's been an environmental movement in the kind of secular world, if you like, there's been an ecological consciousness growing in Catholic social teaching. And if you want to find out more about that, all you have to do is look in the footnotes of Laudato Si. The Pope wants to show, I am not making this up. This isn't me waking up and being like, hey guys, the climate crisis is a thing, isn't it? It's not like that. He really wants to show this deep sense of continuity. And I would even go so far as to say there's very little in Laudato Si that is actually new. There are few things that I would say, and we can come back to that if you're interested, a few things, probably not the things that everyone thinks, are actually new. But the overall tenor of it as a series, if you like, a claim that the ecological crisis or the natural world or whatever is a proper object of Catholic concern, that is not new at all. The new thing, well, there are new claims, but perhaps the thing that is distinctive about Laudato Si is the clarity of its formulation, the degree of its focus, as in the clarity of the formulation that this is an issue of concern. The way in which it's all joined up, both with secular and scientific sources, as well as within the Church's tradition, and additionally, the scope of its address. Right, so it's not just saying, Catholics, you need to be very good about taking care of the environment. It's not saying that. It's a call to humanity that we are in the emergency room with the planet. And that is a distinctive feature of this letter. The concern with the environment itself is certainly not new.
Okay. Yeah, the Pope is, of course, as well referring that his name is as well, is of course Francis and Francis of Assisi. And I think there is a deeper tradition there. And yet, I think that is, in that sense, maybe a break. At least there's a whole debate about the role of Christianity in relation to causing the ecological crisis, of having a role there in that. So in that sense, you can say it. Maybe you can say all kind of things have been said earlier, and yet you could say it was not part of a key emphasis on Christianity. There was this more emphasis on explore the earth, use it, or is that a misconception? How would you say that?
Oh, that's a deep one.
That's a difficult
that's a difficult one.
Yeah.
So, in 1967, a man called Lynn White wrote a very famous paper called "The Roots of the Ecological Crisis," in which he made this and became the first one very clearly to make this claim that Christianity was in a way the agent of the ecological crisis because of its understanding of the place of human beings in the natural order. That the human being is in some way the king of creation and that everything exists only to serve human beings and the license to exploit. And since 1967, so this is a long time ago, if I could describe to you the amount of ink that has been spilt over this question by academics, just the libraries gathering around this theme. And
it caused an ecological crisis in itself.
It's caused exactly. And it's also caused a bit of an intellectual crisis because everybody is exhausted with this question. I would say...
Sorry for bringing it up.
No, I deserve it, right? I teach this stuff. I actually teach that article. Okay. I think everybody now agrees that Lynn White's... Everybody. There is everybody never agrees in academia, but there is a growing perception that Lynn White's analysis was too simple, that things are a lot more complicated, that cause and effect is more complicated, that Christianity's legacy, ecological legacy, has been more multi-layered and, can I say, ambiguous in the sense of not only bad. At the same time, I think it's, and by the way, the jury is still out, and I think the studies need to go on because these are very complex historical questions, and we need another generation, right, of study, historical study, to establish the exact contours of this. At the same time, I think it's important not to deny Christian ideas and Christian texts have been routinely used to justify exploitative practices. Also in relation to other human beings, as we all know.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? When a tradition becomes as dominant and pervasive in the world as Christianity has, it's almost inevitable that its sources, whether they be texts or practices, get used in increasingly unruly and promiscuous ways, often to justify things that people wanted to do anyway, or that the new technologies gave them the ability to do and they needed a license to do it. And it's inescapably apparent that that's happened. At the same time, it's very important to notice, and I say this, I'm not a social scientist, and this is also a present area of study, there is loads of evidence that that cultures that don't come out of the Judeo-Christian route, if you like, once they gain access to the same technologies, have very similar effects on their environments.
So it is more a matter of, you can say, modernization, the modern world. Industrialization, technology, etc. Once it becomes available, then whatever cultural background you kind of are getting into it.
Also because in many cases the damage it's simply not foreseen. People don't go out there intending to damage. The damage that many of these technologies do they're not damages that were deliberately built into them. I mean, nobody planned fossil fuels to be an ecological disaster. It is, of course, also true that even once we found out they were an ecological disaster, we haven't been able to stop using them. But that's to one side. The point I'm trying to make is this is a story of unintended consequences. And that's true for all kinds of technologies. Here's an important point in that connection. It seems that, and this is a key concern of Laudato Si, a distance from nature is implicit in the technological agenda. Right? That's precisely the way in which we are not at home in nature. We have a distance from it, we have an estrangement from it, if you like, that is coterminous with the advent of technological civilization. That's precisely the way in which we stand back and we say, I don't have to only be in my environment, I can also manipulate my environment, I can also take control of my environment. This is the beginning of what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, and he's not a fan. And I think that it's more complex, and this would be, I have various concerns or criticisms of Laudato Si in a context of overall admiration, but I do have some criticisms, and I think Pope Francis' negative assessment of the technocratic paradigm is excessive, and we can come back to that if that's interesting. But it seems to me that when we think about the agency in the ecological crisis, or causes of the ecological crisis, there is a profound alienatedness from our natural home, if you like, that is endemic in modern post-industrial civilization. And that was almost inevitable once the technological powers made it possible to achieve this distance. And the question, in a way, is what kinds of assessments of these technologies should we pursue? And how can we regain a sense of home? You know, the subtitle of this encyclical is on the care of our common home. Pope Francis is trying to say, whether we like it or not, whether we feel it or not, this is our home and we need to live in it like that. And the technologies that we use must serve that.
Yeah, I recently was studying again a little bit of the work of Günther Anders. I don't know you know his, but he had this beautiful phrase and a telling phrase about what in German the Antikiertheit des Menschen. That people, humanity is kind of getting, you could say, always lagging behind the technological development, and you are kind of almost antique in your own world because you kind of first the technology developed itself, and then you're starting, well, okay, what are all the implications, what are the consequences, etc. And it is not always possible to foresee it, but he was particularly thinking about the nuclear bomb.
Yes.
Was his context. So, well, we developed this and we use it even, and then after we said we can never undiscover it again. But we don't have the ethical and the moral infrastructure to really to deal with it, actually. And I think that is always the kind of dialectic that you see there. Yeah.
Precisely. And that is, of course, shall we say, that is the main concern of Laudato Si. What is the underlying moral disability that drives this crisis? And that's also an arguable point. I think he's roughly right, but it's important, and this is another weakness of the document, I think. And by the way, I don't only want to talk about its weaknesses. It's a sign, by the way, of how successful it's been. Mainly, that it's the object of dialogue. Laudato Si is the dialogue partner, but it's not. The problem we're talking about as a moral crisis is it makes it sound as though all of us are equally morally failing, and that each one of us should take personal moral responsibility for the extent of the crisis. And I think that's not true. And that doesn't come across anywhere near strongly enough in Laudato Si. It comes across more strongly in Laudate Deum, which is his kind of 10-year follow-up, right? But it's still not as strong as I would want to make it. I think one of the things, there's the role that are played by technology, but there's also the role played by extremely unequal power dynamics, both between the global north and the global south, and also between different actors in the global south, in such a way that the narrative that we must all take moral responsibility, or that this is a moral crisis that is shared by all of us because we're all sinners and that's why this terrible crisis has happened, that I think is inaccurate and untrue. Most people at the global scale, most people are victims and not perpetrators of this crisis. Many of the people who will suffer the effects of climate change, as we all know, and ecological devastation, had no role in creating it and have not benefited from the fruits of industrialization, or have benefited only a tiny bit. And that's at the global scale, right? So we're talking about people in the global south. Pope Francis coins this term, ecological sin and ecological conversion, to talk about getting our relationship with nature right. And I think it is bordering on grotesque to invite a person, I don't know, a woman living in sub-Saharan Africa, to go through an ecological conversion. She has so little, and this, by the way, is a tragedy, an utter, and a disgrace that we should all be ashamed of. She has almost no agency. What would it mean for her to go through ecological conversion? She has almost no choice. And additionally, the idea that her personal ecological sin is somehow involved in this crisis, it's offensive. So I think we need to be when we talk the language of moral crisis, we need to be very careful. It's much more of a moral crisis for some than it is for others. Yeah.
Well, is it in a way, it's interesting, we can talk about in a few moments about your whole personal take on this further, but as far as I can see, what I would say still, although I certainly see your point, but still what kind of seems unique in the whole ecological debate, what Laudato Si does is indeed address the social issues as well. And make it into both a kind of social justice question in terms of north and south, rich and poor, as well as an ecological question. Yes. I think that concern is there, although I see your point too, that you say, well, there is this kind of perhaps too undifferentiated discourse about humanity as ecological sinners, but still I think... You're completely right. That is in a way... So somebody actually described to Pope Francis, described Laudato Si as your environmental encyclical, and he said, no, it isn't. Okay. Mm-hmm. He said, the environmental and the social can't be distinguished like that. No. So the bringing together, and in fact, to quote Laudato Si, he says, every true ecological approach always becomes a social approach and vice versa. The methodological hallmark of Laudato Si, and I would argue of the Catholic social tradition in general, is, to use the technical term, it's integrality. It's seeing everything as being connected. It's refusing the compartmentalization of domains. It's not allowing politics to be politics over here, and economics to be economics over here, and science to be science over here. It's saying these are all part of a shared, or these are all perspectives on a shared single reality, which is the reality of the world. And any full account of any situation will necessarily draw on and bring in all of these perspectives. And the relationship between society and nature, the relationship between people and one another, the relationship between the spiritual and the material, right? There's this... All of these things need to be integrated into a single vision, a coherent, unifying vision. The
relationship between the human being and nature is precisely not a binary relationship. It's not that human society is here and nature is here. Pope Francis says very clearly, thinking like that is actually part of the problem. We need to see that humans and the natural world are part of, if you like, the single fabric or tapestry of creation in which everything is connected. It doesn't make sense to try to address social issues apart from environmental issues, and vice versa. And we might add the same is also true of political issues.
Your chair is called chair in Integral Ecology, so
yeah,
that's what you are exactly now already referring to now.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps tell a little bit about, you are a theologian, philosopher. How did you yourself come to all these issues? What has been, can you a little bit say about your own path, your own way toward this?
I was very blessed to have a childhood that was spent largely in nature. I grew up in very beautiful rural parts of the United Kingdom. My father was a photojournalist, and we travelled all over the world when I was a child, together as a family, to very, very wild and remote places. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a very famous veterinarian. And we used to do his rounds together. Working with animals was very important. He was a passionate naturalist, and he would take us out into the natural world and teach us about the birds and the plants and the mushrooms and all these kinds of things. And from very, very early on in life, I was taught, not necessarily explicitly but implicitly, a habit or a posture of wonder before nature. A habit or posture of curiosity, of wishing to understand, of wishing to go deeper, which came always with this deep sense of respect. My grandfather, the veterinarian, he wasn't sentimental about nature, but there was this deep respect, this sense that this is the context of our life, and our responsibility is to take that seriously. And that was tremendously formative for me, so much so...
you went to study biology, but
yeah,
no, you ended up in theology and philosophy. Yeah, okay.
As a teenager, I would have said, well, I want to be a scientist.
Yeah.
But at some point, it became apparent that the questions I was asking about nature, not only nature, but also nature, as well as human life, weren't answered only or mainly within the ambit of the natural sciences. And I noticed that although I had this passionate scientific interest and couldn't let go of that, a kind of naturalistic interest in nature and in plants and animals and ecosystems, that I actually needed to study theology and philosophy in order to be able to ask the questions I was interested in. The questions not only about, you know, the particular life of this particular frog, but about the very existence of the frog, about the very existence of the ecosystem, about the place of human beings in the order of things, about why the natural world, while being beautiful, is also full of suffering. Why the human world, while being beautiful, is also full of pain and injustice and violence. And these questions, put it this way, the scientific questions came to be apparent as a subset of a larger set of questions that absolutely unavoidably went beyond the natural sciences as traditionally conceived. And so I did study theology and philosophy, and I came back to science. I studied biology at postgraduate level in my 20s. And I eventually wrote my doctoral work on the relationship between theology and science, theology and philosophy and science. I would say the scientific interest never went away. The love for and interest in an engagement with the natural world, it never went away. Quite the opposite. I would say it's grown rather than diminished. But it's had its place within a wider sensibility for the deepest and largest questions that need to be asked. When I was a child, I was actually taught about the climate crisis. When I was only 10, we already were being taught about that in school. And I was profoundly affected, terrified, distressed, mortified at the idea that all of this beauty was at risk. And it's been, you know, the kind of major moral narrative of my life has been watching with fear and dread and grief the slow, steady deterioration of all of this beauty, and indeed of the capacity of this beauty to support and enable human life. And in that, almost spontaneously, in a way that I could never have planned, the science, the theology, the philosophy, the ethics all came together into a single concern. It became apparent that this crisis, yes, this is a crisis in our relationship with nature, in our relationship with ourselves, that demanded the engagement of scientists and the bringing to bear of scientific knowledge, but also demanded our engagement at the deepest level of meaning, of purpose, of the right, of the good, of the true, of the beautiful, all of the things that philosophy and theology do, the kind of daily work of philosophy and theology, that we need all of these things. And I just so happened, emotionally, intellectually, was very well placed to engage that. And indeed, I might add, that I could not sleep at night if I didn't. Whether I had theology or philosophy or science or not, it's an absolute moral imperative for me.
Did you become a kind of climate pessimist, or we have a lot of now the climate fear is there, climate anxiety, which, well, we have this other, how's she called in the UK, who has said, well, I guess well grew up and I became totally pessimistic, and then I had to break away from this in a way, and I forgot her name now. Well, we can add it later. But then she showed the book. Well, actually, it's still serious, but kind of we need to have the positive things there. How did you deal with this climate anxiety, or what would you say now if you have developing and you have been studying philosophy, theology, and so in what way do you deal with it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something interesting. I've been speaking.
Hannah Ritchie is the name.
Hannah Ritchie.
Yeah,
exactly. yeah.
Actually, so
yes,
perhaps we can do this again briefly.
That can be edited.
Say, well, you just did you become kind of a climate pessimist, and how do you deal with it? We have the story of Hannah Ritchie as well from the UK, and she was kind of. Yeah, you can say totally, in despair, so to say, which kind of made her inactive, passive. So okay, I cannot do nothing about it. And then eventually she started to develop more kind of studies of the things that are going well. Although she does not deny anything of the climate crisis there, but she really wanted to counter her own pessimism and her own not only pessimism but as well. Passive apathy, so to say, caused by that. Yeah. How do you deal with that, or how did you deal with it, or are you still in that stage, perhaps? Or
I mean, absolutely, absolutely. And the news that came a few days ago of the outcome of the American election is a moment where one needs to ask that question, because that is truly devastating. Specifically with respect to ecological and climate concerns, absolutely devastating. An interesting thing, I've been speaking and teaching in all kinds of spaces, public and academic, about this for nearly a decade. I have never not been asked that question. That's the single question I can guarantee somebody will ask. How do you stay hopeful? Yeah. Or do you feel despair? This kind of family of concerns. Yeah. I'm not optimistic, but I'm also not pessimistic. Let me try and explain. Christianity, I believe, is neither an optimism nor a pessimism, and preferably goes beyond both. Christianity is a practice of hope, and hope is not a practice of hope. Okay. Yeah. And hope is not the same as optimism. Václav Havel, who I think is one of the people who has articulated this. It has been articulated, although not as often as it should be. He said the following: optimism is the belief that things will turn out well. Hope is the conviction that things make sense no matter how they turn out. Christianity is hope. There are, in fact, in many human situations, no particular reason to be optimistic. But hope is based on a choice, a faith, you might say, that the structure of reality itself is towards the good. that the grain of reality, like the grain of this table, the grain of this wood, is towards the good, is towards beauty, is towards love, whatever the word is that works for you. Christianity is staying in touch with that. It's staying in touch with that deep character of the world as being fundamentally good and resting on that, if you like, or being resourced by that to keep going and to keep doing the right thing, even when it seems like there's no point. The most extraordinary examples from all across Christian history, and it's of course not only Christians, but I'm thinking about Christians, the really inspiring lives, they're the lives of people who acted for the good, even when there seemed to be no point. Even when they couldn't see that in the situation they were in, anything could ever change. Even when it seemed from a kind of outward point of view, only bleak, only despairing. But they still acted, because that's the kind of world this is. It's a world that is oriented to the good. And that's because of God, right? That reality is basically from and for and infused, if you like, with God and with God's love. That sounds sentimental, but it is anything but sentimental. It's the most gritty, hard-nosed, realistic thing that you can do. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put it very well, I think. He said, the Christian calling, when it comes to our practical life, our material life, our political, social, economic, and so on life, the Christian calling is to see the world without denial and without despair. There is to be no denying how bad things are. But despair is the posture of somebody who has no hope, who doesn't think that reality has within its very structure the goodness and the love of God. That's how I keep going. It's not because I look around and think, I think we can make this work. This looks, we have a reasonable chance of success. We may have, or we may not. Actually, nobody knows. The situation is way too complex to be either optimistic or pessimistic. We simply don't know. What we can do is stay rooted at a deeper level in order to be able to act. And that's the key thing. If we don't have hope, we cannot act. Pope Benedict wrote in his fabulous encyclical, which I would recommend to everybody, Spe Salvi, which means in Latin, in hope we are saved. That's a quote from St. Paul. He writes this: all serious and upright human conduct is hope in action. Hope is actually the condition of action. Why? Let me explain. I was at a talk recently by Bryan Stevenson, who is a lawyer who founded the Equal Justice Initiative in the US. So they defend mostly young black men on death row. And he's a Christian. And in the talk that I was at, somebody very hostile to religious faith asked him, why in your work do you need Christianity? Why do you need faith? What's that got to do with it? And he said, there was a long silence and he thought deeply. And then he said, if you don't believe in a world you cannot see, you will never change this one. That's what I'm talking about. That's what Martin Luther King was talking about when he says, I went to the top of the mountain. That famous I have a dream speech. Everybody knows the bit about I have a dream, but they forget. This is a biblical image of being taken to the top of the mountain by God, like Moses, right? This is a picture, right? Don't get worried about, did Moses really do this? This is a picture to communicate this intuition. He goes to the top of the mountain and he sees the possibility of a different world. And then he goes back down to the tough, lonely, apparently hopeless situation of the people of God, the people of Israel, of all of us on this planet, whatever. And he says, I've seen it. It is possible. It doesn't exist yet, but it is possible. And Martin Luther King gave his life for that. That's the character of Christian action. And there are so many examples from history, and we need to keep them in our minds, right? Not just Christians, but anyone who wants to be a person of hope, who wants practices of hope. We need to look at these examples. Christians, people of faith, staying in touch with that sense. There is another world, and that we cannot see, that we cannot touch, but we can move towards it. We can bring it into reality with the actions that we take. Without that, it's paralysis, it's numbness, it's apathy.
And would you consider that as the main contribution, you can say, of the Encyclical or of the Church message into the for the ecological debate in general, or say, and that you say, well, without this, and because you are very much now focusing on Christianity and your own Christian inspiration, yet the Encyclical and the whole ecological debate, of course, is of the ecological problems. To all of humanity. So how would you bridge this?
Yeah. Well, after I'd studied Christian theology at the University of Oxford, which is what I did instead of doing biology or zoology, which I was also tempted to do, I actually went to Cambridge and studied Asian and Eastern religion and philosophy. That was a very important influence for me, and I wasn't always Catholic. And I practiced Zen Buddhism for a long time, and non-Christian religious traditions have been an extremely important part of my formation, and they still are very important dialogue partners for me. And I would be the first to say it's not about Christianity somehow having a kind of exclusive access to these habits of mind or heart. I do think Christianity has a kind of a unique power to speak into this situation, but I'll come back to that because it's not quite the question that you asked. In terms of what the contribution is of theology and philosophy, or of the religions or something like that, I'm wary of talking about a contribution. Let me explain. Thomas Merton, the famous American monk, was once asked, he was a master of novices in his monastery. He was once asked by a novice how to have a spiritual life. And he said, and these I think are truly immortal words and worthy of so much reflection and consideration. He said, there is no such thing as having a spiritual life. Either all of your life is spiritual or none of it is. Yeah. Spirituality or religion, whatever you want to call it, there's a whole family of words now that we have which aren't very well organised, but whatever you want to call that dimension of life, it's not something that you bolt on to all of the stuff that you're already doing, either individually or as a society. It's the tenor in which you do everything. It's the kind of disposition or the habit of mind or the habit of heart or the habit of perception that shapes and influences absolutely everything from root to tip. And in that sense, and Laudato Si, I think, is a good example of this. It's not so much that there's the contribution of politics, the contribution of economics, the contribution of climate science, and then there's the contribution of theology or philosophy. That's not the role that they ever played in history. It's a very modern idea that they should have their thing that they say along with all the other experts. It's more like, it's something more, our spirituality, which includes, by the way, if we think we don't have one, I just mean the entire world picture or set of meanings that we have in our life, in our sense of things. It's more like the water we swim in. You know, there's lots of things in the fish tank, and there is the fish, but the water we swim in is the actual medium of our existence. It's the medium of our life. Whatever we take to be the meaning of the world or the direction of the world or the lack of it, that's the water that we're swimming. There's a fantastic short speech by David Foster Wallace, the American author, which expresses this idea called This is Water. It's absolutely brilliant. 12 minutes. Like best 12 minutes of your life. Watch it. It's so good. We're
going to do it. We can even put it here as a recommendation on the video.
Really can't recommend it higher. That's the quality that the faiths or philosophy or, spirituality, this family of stuff, that's what it is. It's the water that we swim in. And if we don't swim in the right water, we're paralysed. So the reason we need these disciplines of philosophy and theology, or we need religion or spirituality, is because that's the condition of everything. But if you say it is always there, then it doesn't have anything
to contribute. You could say, so what Merton was saying, the quote that you were using right there, saying, well, either everything is spiritual or none of it is. But if it is, is it possible to have a non-spiritual life in this perspective, or and isn't it always there, but then becomes kind of empty almost? So I still think, shouldn't you talk about something like, I agree with what you were saying about a contribution, which then can be nicely put in a box. So there we have a box, and then we add it up and we mix something and we take something out of it. But so I see very much the depth of what you are saying, and yet I think it is possible to have a non-spiritual attitude, or let's say materialistic or short-sighted or whatever. Or what is? How would you still say? Well, why we need. Yes, it is always there, and yet you can as well deny it, I think. So what is...
that's helpful. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody has a sense, and all societies and cultures as well, so this is true at many scales, has a sense. Usually it's implicit and unarticulated, occasionally it's explicit and articulated, of who they are, why they are, what they're supposed to do, what everything is all about. To put it in the very most agnostic terms. Everybody has that. Otherwise, we can't have any agency, right? Because by which I mean we can't or we don't act, because acting is always, as Aristotle correctly said, acting is always acting for a goal. Right? Something has to be perceived as being worthwhile in order for us to act. There's always these value judgments about what should we do, where should we go, what direction should we go in, who should I try to be, what should I focus on, how should I act, in what spirit, and so on. It's that quality that I'm trying to identify, because that's not a finding of science. It's also not something that we just pick out of a textbook. Like, I think I'll be that. I think I'll have that orientation or that overall outlook, or whatever it is that you want to call this. Identifying and making that explicit and evaluating the way we are in that space, that's the work of philosophy and theology when they're doing well, ideally. Within that space, and this I think is a very important task, some of the orientations, outlooks, sensibilities we have about meaning and purpose and value, some of them are enabling, helpful, humanizing. Some bring with them justice, some bring with them beauty, some bring with them power in the good sense, the power to act, the power to have and find meaning and give meaning to others. Others do the opposite. When Pope Francis says this is a spiritual crisis, he means it's a crisis in that space. So if we are going to talk about a contribution of theology or philosophy, the contribution would be to help us to discern and appreciate and understand and evaluate our life and our experience and our action in that kind of space. And there is nobody who doesn't live in that space, just like there is no fish that is not in water. So in that sense, there is a contribution, but it's not really a discreetly delimitable, in this bit of your life, like on Sunday morning, it concerns the things that you do on Sunday morning, but on Monday when in the office, it's kind of not relevant. It's more pervasive than that, and it's trying to get at that pervasiveness and trying not to compartmentalize it, because part of the very structure, and this is an academic conversation, which I know that you will be familiar with. I mean academic in the rich sense, an important intellectual question. Part of the structure of modernity is it's made this space seem like an optional added extra, like a hobby, like, he's into football, she's into church. As soon as it's become like that, it's lost, it's over. Then religion is just a name for another thing that people do. Whereas in fact, the thing that the concept of religion or spirituality or theology or whatever it is that you want to call it, the thing that those concepts are trying to get at is that water that we swim in. That if we don't take the time to get some process of critical reflection about that, we don't get to ask whether this whether this is a true, trustworthy, helpful medium for us to work in or not. And in fact, when people want to criticise, I don't know, let's take an extreme example, National Socialism. You know, what was wrong with it? Why was it so bad, everyone? Why was it so... Oh, well, it was unfair and it was evil and it was bad and it was dehumanising and it was, you know, all of the words we might bring to mind to describe something like that. People are trying to characterise it in exactly that space. The water that they were swimming in back then, that wasn't good. That wasn't good. So how should we be feeling ourselves in the world?
Yeah, because I think that brings us as well to what is happening now, of course. I think the anti-climate or the anti-ecological powers are gaining traction right now with the election of Trump, but you see all kind of things happening in Europe too. And so apparently the water for people can be quite different in that way.
Exactly.
And yeah, how would you respond to that? People who say, well, climate denial is there, of course, but as well, even say, well, but I just don't want it. I want something else.
Yeah.
And we need economic growth, we need all kind of things, and whatever we need to go on in the situation, in the track that we are in now, and don't talk about anything else.
Yeah.
So apparently this water can be quite different, even at a spiritual level, perhaps. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, it's all the more important that we have available critical tools to ask critical questions on that level. People choose to live with different kinds of meaning, with different kinds of orientation, different kinds of values. One of the sort of shibboleths of modern liberal global north societies is that we shouldn't have a view about other people's meanings. You have your meaning, I'll have mine. You have your values, I'll have mine. You have your religion, I'll have mine, and so on. One of the things that the way that the world has been unfolding in recent years shows is we have to have judgments about other people's meanings and values. It's an absolute fantasy to think that we could avoid that. We must be able to evaluate in a normative way the values and purposes and forms of conduct that there are in the world. And that's not the same as going around with a sledgehammer and saying, you're not allowed to believe whatever you want. You know, people immediately like, she wants to bring back the Inquisition. Come on. It's more nuanced than that. Mm-hmm. What's happening in so many parts of our world with the rise of populism, authoritarianism, I might say, totalitarianism, denialism, deceit, evasion, the shameless manipulation of power, the holding hostage of political processes by a few individuals with their, you know, to serve their own interests. I'm thinking about fossil fuel companies. They're doing it all the time. These things need to be called out. That is like a spirituality. That is a way of living in the world that we cannot be okay with. And that's not me calling for World War III. That's me calling for some more actual, robust, critical, articulated, shared moral debate about who do we want to be? How do we want to be in this world? What is this world even about? If we can't ask the question of what this world is about in the very deepest and broadest sense, how can we generate a sense of how we should live? And if we're not willing to talk about how we should live, we can't even criticise these kinds of movements. We can't even criticise Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Well, he just has his values and that works for him. And the Ukrainian values, it's a pity, but they don't really count because he has more power and more weapons and more money and whatever else. None of us wants to say that. We have to sustain, and by the way, it's not just sustain, it's recover, because we kind of lost it, a normative, the capacity to have a normative conversation about who we should be and how we should live and what this world really is and is for. The diminishment of philosophy and theology, sorry, this is my last point on this. The diminishment of philosophy and theology as disciplines is genuinely dangerous because those are the disciplinary spaces in which that conversation is had and which people are equipped, given the language, given the concepts, given the frameworks, to have that conversation. Forget even to have the conversation, to have the actual thoughts in this space. They must be, we need that. We need it so badly right now, and we must fight for that somehow.
Thank you very much. Actually, we are already the end is there in terms of time. I think we could talk for quite a long time and continue this conversation. We can do perhaps
it's only the beginning.
Only the beginning. Thank you very much. And I think your final appeal to have well space for theology, philosophy, for the humanities in basic. I think that's very much topical as well in a political situation in the Netherlands, but I think globally. I think.
Yeah.
So I really would support that actually, and thank you very much for this engaging conversation.
Absolute pleasure.
I think so, and I wish you all the best with your chair that you are going to that you are now already working in, and I hope you will have a good how do you say it response in the Netherlands, but outside of that too. And,
thank you. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. It's a new country for me, so it's a learning curve.
Well, great.
I'm looking forward to getting to know everybody.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
En dat was het eigenlijk voor ons nu. Thank you all for listening to this conversation, and keep an eye on what Carmody Grey is doing in Nijmegen. And thank you for watching.